Everin.
Hi there.
How are you doing today?
Good. I'm just moving location. Be with you a second.
Hi, Trask. Hi, Lee.
Hey, folks.
Hey, everyone.
Okay. So let's give Benji a couple of more minutes. Let's see. Benji.
Man, I thought your name looked familiar. I just replied to your semantic convention issue today.
Oh, wonderful. Because we were wondering about that.
Hmm. Okay. Then start. We have to open a couple of things. Mhm. Okay. Cool. So hello everyone. Nice that you all could join this month. Let's do the second meeting of the Open Telemetry work group. let's have a quick look at the agenda. So first of all, by being here, we all agree to the specification membership agreement, the participation guideline, contribution guidelines, code of conduct, and so on of the foundation. You have links here in the agenda if you want to review them, and then you can review them. And you just by being here, you agree to these conditions. Then let's do a quick round of introduction. We do this every time for people which watch this on YouTube later on. This will be published on YouTube. So if they just want to join in for this session. Hi, I'm Pascal. I work for Chili Cream. I'm a graphical TSC, and I am pushing at the moment that we have a bit of a consistent open telemetry semantic conventions in the graphical ecosystem. Next one would be Trusk.
Yeah, hey, I'm at Microsoft, but primarily working on OpenTelemetry, and I'm a semantic convention maintainer, and here to help you with anything you need from the OpenTelemetry side. We do love to see things getting defined and groups doing this externally.
Awesome. Ellie?
Hey, I'm Ellie. I work for PayPal, and one of our big challenges in observability right now is observability of GraphQL systems and kind of the lack of standard industry-wide practices for that. So the stuff we're doing internally lines up very well with what this group is trying to do. So I'm very happy to be here.
Great. Rin?
I'm Bryn. I work for Apollo, primarily on the Apollo router, but I'm also a user of the router. So I've got a bit of insights into both providing telemetry for users, but also being a consumer of OTel.
Great, cool. Let's see, maybe Benji joins later. Like people that follow the ecosystem know him anyway really well. So if there's anyone which wants to take notes, that would be great. We have the AI summary, which also is done automatically. You can do a pull request afterwards with your notes that you have done to the same document where the AI summary will go. And we also have a few documents that we'll just work on during where we can put in notes. Okay, so quick review, what we'll do today. I think we should quickly talk about how we can communicate asynchronously so that when someone has a question that we don't have to wait a month for this question to be answered. This can either be through discussions, issues, whatever, we'll see. And then specifically today, I put 15 minutes so that we have a bit of time left because it will probably take longer anyway. About what resource and trace span attributes we have and what's relevant, what's not relevant. And I think we should first focus a bit on tracing and then metrics. I don't think logs are too relevant in this specific in graphical, but definitely tracing and metrics is something that we should talk about. Okay. Is there anything else? Sorry.
The possible relevance of logs, well, events in OpenTelemetry are defined on the log signal, and we may look at things like payloads, like if people want to capture payloads, bigger things like that as events, like kind of like debug level events or something, but that can come later.
Yeah, I mean, I have many ideas for events because not everything has to be a span. For example, validation and so on of a document could maybe be done with events, but that's a bit where we have to find out what's best practice in OTel and so on. Okay, then is there anything else that people would like to talk about today? Then we can just add it to the agenda now on the fly. Okay, great. Cool. So the about communicating asynchronously, what I found, so as it is with these work groups, usually you schedule the work group to be in 2 weeks or in a month, and then it doesn't matter the time span of the iteration that you do. You always do nothing until 2 days before, and then you're like, oh, tomorrow is work group, and then you start working on the stuff that you want to use, you want to discuss. So actually, when I checked the work group last week, I saw that there was no one entering, no one in the agenda yet, and it would have been great if I just have one place, where I can ping people. Hey, next week is work group, and that would also be a good place where we can exchange messages with each other, or we can ask questions and dig deep in the knowledge of Trusk when we have something which is very open telemetry specific. So I'm open to what we can use there. I think for discussions that we have about the specific topic, like for example the attributes that we will start defining today, pull requests, issues, and discussions on GitHub are great. If we ever have the need for chatting with each other, then we would have to define something. Either we do a mailing list, or we we can use the graphical Discord or whatever. So with it, do you think that it's enough if we just work on GitHub, or do you think we should create something for instant messaging as well?
I'd like to try GitHub first, and if we find that it doesn't work, then that's something that we can tackle. But yeah, certainly I was thinking last time, oh, it'd be great to have the discussions tab in GitHub available, because I actually had no idea even when the next meeting was going to be. So yeah,
I will make a note, because
I just watched the repo right now so that I will get notified of issues and discussions and whatnot over there.
good, that's good. Discussions.
I don't mind using issues for discussions, but
Yeah,
I don't mind.
I use GitHub every day, all day long, and I never really warmed up with discussions. So it's just for
Same.
everything which, for me, discussions are often a bit deaf null. Like as soon as something is in a discussion, it's completely off my radar, and then I don't see it. But we can enable it, and then I can also subscribe to it. That's great. Okay, cool. So that's these 5 minutes done. So let's have a quick look about at the tracing and the attributes. Everything which I've done here in this sheet will eventually go into the repository. It's just that editing Markdown tables is really annoying, and I just thought it's probably easier if we just use a Google Sheets for it. I will send you the link for this as well. It should be open for everyone. Oh no, that's not what I wanted to do. It should be open for everyone. 1 second. Copy link. Can you see my screen again?
Yeah.
So this is the link to the document. Maybe you can have a look. I also saw that I made a mistake here. Just be like this. So I just went ahead and took what we have in the pull request to the semantic conventions repository as a base for discussion. And then we can, in this document, basically define other things that we want to add, or things that that we want to remove as trace attributes. So in OpenTelemetry, how I see it, we also have a big graphical system that we need to monitor, and essentially what we currently use where we have tracing is we have two kinds of spans which are relevant for us. And one is a bit a dangerous one, and the other one is the root span. So the operation span that we have essentially in Hot Chocolate at the moment just displays the execution of an operation. It doesn't have to do anything with HTTP, so it's not the server root kind of span. It's just that there's a HTTP span which comes in, and then we have the graphical server operation span, which basically is as soon as the graphical engine picks up the request from the HTTP stream. Because technically GraphQL is transport independent, even JSON independent. You can theoretically serialize it to whatever you like, but in tracing this becomes a bit relevant, especially when you have different graphical endpoints on the same server, and then you have different HTTP spans. So this one, I believe, is something which we most likely need to have. Like, that's also a very cheap one. It's one span. Most likely it's going to be, for a normal graphical server, it's one span per request. For a, unless you use batching or use, I actually don't know how variable batching would work with this. Maybe then you would have per batch one, per item in the batch one graphical server operation span. But that's essentially the root span of the graphical operation. Are there any comments on it, or do we all agree that this most likely makes sense to have?
I think one of the questions that comes up here to me is, are we looking at the server as a HTTP server, which gets a request to a specific path that then, as a child span, invokes a GraphQL operation? I know a lot of the GraphQL services that I work on, we really just look at the GraphQL operation because the endpoint's always going to be the same, the status code is always going to be the same. And so the endpoint and status code effectively create noise in our observability tools and break things like trace metrics and things like that. And so if you want to start deriving trace metrics from your server operations, you end up needing like separate metrics depending on whether we're talking about GraphQL or REST. And I think like this point specifically here is one of those that what we've done internally is we've actually added an Apollo server plugin that hacks this and overrides the span name with the GraphQL operation name to try to make our trace metrics work. But I definitely think there should be a more standard path there that takes that into account.
Yeah, so we do the same in Hot Chocolate. We walk up the activities and rename the root span wherever this is possible. I think it's more of a, like, these are two completely different components that we're talking about. So there's the HTTP part of a server and there's the GraphQL part. Yeah, Bryn?
I completely agree. We started off renaming the root span and mixing these two concerns, and honestly, it ended up a mess. There's very clear, well-used conventions for HTTP server now, and APMs will understand that out of the box. So if we go and mess with that, then actually that would be much more difficult for users in the long run.
It's also not always possible. Like, for example, the .NET team changed something in the telemetry, that they actually lazily set the path on the root span. So even when we override it, it's always going to be /GraphQL/slug. So
Yeah.
it's not always possible to do these things.
Yeah, and actually, what we've found is a lot of APMs, they're able to search on something that isn't the root span. So we keep with the semantic conventions for HTTP. We do something, that the child span of that is going to be our GraphQL server operation. And actually it seems to be fine for most APMs.
Yeah. I think what we have to define here, or we just have to agree on, is what happens in a batching scenario. Just we don't have to like specify it, but it would be interesting. It's also a bit specification dependent. Like I don't know, Bryn, how up to date are you with the composite schema specification?
Honestly, not very.
So there's a new concept. It's an old concept, just differently solved, which solves the problem differently. There's this concept of variable batching. Essentially, when you, for example, have a field called the product by ID, with variable batching, if your server supports variable batching, you can essentially send a batch of IDs and then execute this operation with these variable batches. Reason for this being is that you don't need to have a batch resolver like products by IDs to resolve many products. You can just say I have product by ID, which internally maybe uses a data loader or whatever to optimize it. But essentially, you can send a batch of variables to execute. And that is a bit, it's one way of batching. The other one is the classic request batching, which I think is part of the HTTP over GraphQL specification, but I'm not sure. And the question is, should that be one operation span or many operation spans? That's a bit where we have to land on. It depends also how the specification treats it, right?
I'd love for us to actually create a discussion about this because I I don't know the answer right now, and
Yeah.
I think it might take some thinking about actually.
Okay.
So maybe I don't know. Maybe this discussion can then spawn actual discussions in GitHub that we can then take on asynchronously.
Exactly. Yeah, I think I will, as soon as we get some like, I expect this document to be very dynamic at first, and then it will settle down quite quickly. And then, hi Benji. And then we can put it into a markdown and actually do pull requests to it and have discussion on the pull requests.
Uh-huh.
So that's,
Okay.
that's easy. Yeah, so whatever shape or form this operation span will have is to define by us, but I'm pretty sure that this is something that we need. And I also agree with Bryn there. I don't think we can mess with the root span because it's just different things that we trace there. Personally, on service I maintain, I rewrite the root spans because, or I have done it in the past. Now with Nitro, we just use the specific one which looks for GraphQL server operation. We don't have to rename the root ones, just because our APM supports it. But you can, like, if you want to use something like Elastic or the how's it called, the Azure Monitor thingy, then you may have to have the ability to group. But that's something that is it's not really specification based. Like we cannot change this from a specification point of view. Now, potential attributes which I see relevant on the operations are the ones that we have discussed last time. So first of all, an optional operation name, which could be set as a tag, as an attribute. Then the type of the operation is probably quite useful if it's a query, a mutation, or a subscription.
Would you mind if we change that to requirement level to match the rest of the spec? Because I think there's definitely a distinction there for opt-in.
It's recommended, required, recommended, and opt-in. Yeah.
So it's requirements level. Yeah.
Okay, then requirement. Okay, that would be recommended, optional, or what's the third one?
Opt-in.
Opt-in. So
recommended is like if it's kind of like, hey, yeah, you probably should have it unless there's a reason not to. Oh, there's another which is sort of conditionally required, which you can say like, if it's available, then you need to populate it.
I'm gonna
That's the conditionally required one.
Yeah. So right on so operation name, I'd love to say that that's required, but literally, yeah, in the past few months and weeks, we get people that are basically saying the cardinality of this is just
request.
So that's the problem with operation name is that it's got infinite cardinality. So when you look at some of the other stuff in the HTTP attributes, when they have high cardinality potential stuff, it tends to be opt-in.
Depends on if we're talking spans or metrics here.
Okay.
This
So
would
high
be
cardinality is okay on span attributes.
Okay. Okay. So maybe this is a required then possibly.
I mean, it's conditionally required because you can provide a graphical operation without the name, then you don't have one. So that would be exactly the trust, right? That would exactly the case for a conditionally required. If the user provides one, then
Yeah.
it's right.
Okay.
Yep.
But again, Bryn, I agree with metrics. I think what we have to keep in mind here is that this could be a recommended one for metrics, because in 99% of the servers, you most likely will not reach cardinality limits with your system. But if you're open to the world, you have a public graphical API, or you just have a huge system, then it will just
Super
explode.
dangerous.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. We cannot
So
make it a requirement on the metrics, but it could still be a recommended metric.
Yeah.
Right?
So so it makes sense to me. Yeah. So on spans we have that conditionally required available.
on metrics, I have a question about that operation name. Is it dependent on the user payload?
Yes.
Okay, so we did have a similar issue with HTTP method name, where it is, and we actually got a CVE against the semantic conventions for that because it's controllable by the end users. And so people could, when we had that on metrics, it can be used to overflow your metric system. And so what we did in that case, since there's a we made a list of 9 method names, the most common method names that would be captured. And then like anything else goes into this method original, which isn't in metrics. So we were able to creatively still keep that in metrics, but that could be an issue for you all with having that on metrics by default.
So to give a bit of context here, the reason why I think it should be, we're not talking about metrics now, but in case of metrics, why it should be a recommended one is, or I mean, it could also be opt-in. It doesn't matter in the end. But in most servers, like if you're not having a huge API with many clients, you will not reach the 2000 cardinality limit of the meter, I believe. Like you would have 2000 different operations on your server. Depends on the scale of your system.
The problem is for publicly exposed endpoints.
Definitely.
As an attacker.
That's something we definitely see is like injection attacks against values that then show up in metrics. And even if it's only your code that's calling it, anybody who's pen testing your endpoint could start cardinality.
Okay. So this sounds like, so should we park this for when we talk about metric attributes and get through? We'll complete this list maybe. But it sounds like we definitely need to have a discussion.
Yeah, metrics on paper, metrics look very, very nice. I want to use metrics for everything until you run into the limits. And then you're like, oh no. Oh no. Okay. Yeah, good question from Benji. How does null relate? Like the operation name, correct me if I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong here, Benji. An operation name null and empty string would both be valid valid request parameters, right?
I'm not sure that they necessarily are acceptable. I think it's a string or it's not present. Actually, yeah, null I think is accepted because Facebook would do that. But essentially, I would say that when you store it into this, you would just say it's required, but sometimes it's null if null is allowed when it's required. So that's really the question.
So null isn't, but empty string is. So you could store it as empty string.
Yeah, an operation name can never validly be the empty string, so that would be fine. It's not ideal, but it would be acceptable, I think.
I don't think we have other examples in semantic conventions, though, of capturing empty strings. Generally, we would just omit the attribute if it's an empty string.
Yeah, so conditionally required is probably the best bet then.
Cool.
I think that aligns.
Then the next one is the operation type. This will just be an enumeration of currently and probably also for the foreseeable future to be these three operations: query, mutation, and subscription. I think when I looked at these semantic conventions, it's common to just have them as lowercase methods, so not Pascal case. We don't need any snakes or spaces, so I think that's fine. Yeah, I think that one is pretty straightforward. There is also not much injection that you can do here because it's something that the server detects. Either it's a query mutation or a subscription. Tracing of subscriptions, by the way, is something that we can talk on later. We can talk about later because that's an interesting one. That's a very, very interesting one. Do you really want to have a 30-minute long span? You probably don't, but maybe you do. We don't know. Okay. Yeah, so the operation hash, I can remove this, Benji. Then
So yeah, are we okay to have operation type as required?
yeah, that one is required.
Mhm.
It's also very easy to provide, so required. Sorry. Required. There we go. Yeah, so the graphical operation hash is the hash of the operation document. Now, I think in the meantime, we are more or less settled on SHA-256 as the normal thing to do. Even though I believe Relay still generates them as MD5, the operation hashes as MD5 by default. Now, one thing that we have to, I believe, differentiate here is there is an operation hash and there might be also an operation ID. So these would be two different things. Is this correct, Benji?
Yes, that's right. So there's a document identifier, which would be the thing that you would use for trusted documents. And then there's just an operation hash, which would just be a hash of the document, which would probably be done server-side. I personally would either indicate that the hash should always be of the form hash mechanism, like algorithm, colon, and then the hash. For example, SHA-256 colon, then the hash. Or I would require that there's different attributes like SHA-256 hash, MD5 hash, whatever, and you just implement whichever one you want. I would probably prefer the prefix approach where you have a hash attribute and it indicates the type as part of the format of the value. That way, it's important that you allow for the hash mechanism to change in future.
Are there any examples of this sort of thing in the existing conventions at all for hashes?
That's also would also be my question. Yeah, so that's the one that Benji posted. So Trask, it would be something like this that we would define as a hash. So it's either this, or we would have different tags, different attributes for the different hash algorithms.
I think we have some prior art there. I think the profiling group has kind of a similar hash structure. Let me look up and see what they're doing. If you want to come back to this in a couple minutes.
That's good. So these are two things which so the operation ID is conditionally required, I would say. Like if you provide a document ID in your graphical request, it has to be added to the tracing. If you do not provide one, then you don't have anything to provide. Is this something that are there any other opinions? It's similar to the operation name, right? It's in the same format actually. Okay. And the hash is a question. Should this be recommended? Task, what's the thought process between recommended and required or opt-in? Like what's the reason why you would choose one over the other?
So I mean, required really needs to be like, it's always available and it's always going to be on there. It's something that like backends can rely on. So there don't tend to be very many required fields. It's good to have at least one required field so that people can use that to identify that this is a GraphQL span, since we don't have any other sort of identification means of saying this is an HTTP span or this is a GraphQL span. But otherwise, if it's really there all the time, like type makes a lot of sense to be required. It's just always there. But if not, then recommended is fine. In the guidance we give to instrumentation, at least within the OpenTelemetry org, is that they should follow all the recommended ones unless they have a really good reason not to. So the bar is reasonably high on recommended.
Just following up on that, has there been a discussion about using a standard field that would differentiate, like rather than looking for a required attribute, looking for something like span? I mean, I know there's some things for client server internal, etc., but like what type of work are we doing? Is it HTTP? Is it GraphQL? Is it, is that something that's been talked about yet?
Endlessly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd love that too.
There is a recent, just in the last couple of weeks, proposal. I mean, this has been like talked about for 5 years, this topic. There's a recent proposal that actually, I think, makes some sense that it might actually something happen, because it's saying, hey, we should have a span. Wait, no, now I'm mixing up spans and logs. Anyway, yeah. For now, this is the way it is. Yeah.
Okay. So then I would say this is probably a recommended one. Because there could be cases where you, I don't know, for whatever reason, I mean, every server computes a hash, I would say, but you could argue that it could be non-required. So let's be in the recommended stage here. Okay. I've also added the example here, so that could be my operation. Then we have query. We have SHA. Let's copy this. No, this. Nope. Damn, that was the wrong one. This. And the document identifier would just be A, C, F, most likely. Or whatever the user thinks is best for their system. That's really user driven. Could be anything. Yeah, so maybe before we go into the resolver one, because that's a more tricky one. What's the recommendation of span names? Does cardinality matter there? It depends on the APM system probably, but
So yeah, we do say that it matters, and part of that is that span to metrics pipelines are very common and popular. So yeah.
so in that case, that should just be the graphical a graphical operation, for example. Or we could have a graphical query, a graphical mutation, and a graphical subscription as the span name instead of having the operation name in there.
The operation. Oh, go ahead.
What's the distinction there between the query name and the operation name? Because to me, like if we're looking at a GraphQL like query document, right? So you have like query, some arbitrary name that the client specifies, and then within that we're going to hit a bunch of resolvers, right? And the challenge is that like okay, if we're looking at query overall, the only identifier that I could think of off the top of my head for that is that client specified identifier, which we've said has arbitrary cardinality and is susceptible to attack, right? Otherwise, we're looking at the resolver names, which are limited to what's defined in the schema, but don't resolve to a single node. It's a list of parallel spans there, right? So what is the server operation here?
The server operation is everything as soon as the graphical server, the graphical execution picks up the requests from the HTTP pipeline, meaning you get an HTTP request with a JSON payload to /graphical. This is handled by the HTTP, and then it's handed over to the graphical execution engine. Now, there's a lot of things that happen there where we can talk about what we should do. For example, there is query validation, which runs sometimes if it's cached. If it's a good server, it's cached. Then there is variable coercion, which runs every time when you send a request, because the payload has to be converted into executable values on the server side. And then at some point, the actual execution starts of the request. And what we have to decide is how granular we want to make this on a span basis, and what are potential events, log events that we can issue there. As said, technically, the graphical execution is a bit segmented because you will always first, not always, That's also tricky. But technically, you have a validation, then you have a variable creation, then you have the execution of the actual request. But that could also be grouped together into GraphQL server operation. And then we just have log events that says validation took this long, creation took this long.
It will make me sad if we can't put operation name into span name because of cardinality concerns. Like that is very natural in a lot of this. We actually call it operation name in a lot of the conventions, and that goes into span name. Like they are almost synonymous. So I would probably start with that proposal, but then call out. I can take that. You know what? Let me add that as a topic to next week's semantic convention general meeting to ask for guidance there, because I don't know where we would land on, like, usefulness is very important, but so is the cardinality overflow.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit the thing, right? Like, in my recommendation for most servers is to just include the operation name. Like, because when you have persisted queries, you don't really have to worry about it. Like, it's only your queries that will be executed. Like, you can now argue that you can still send an operation name which wouldn't be in the persisted query, and then you would have to filter them out and do whatever to block against these attacks. But cardinality wise, I think
Yeah.
that makes the tracing actually useful. Like if you would
Yeah.
have exactly the same issue that you have with just /GraphQL if we don't break down by either the operation name or, as Benji pointed out, we could also include the root fields or their root field. But that's a problem because then there's again the possibility of an attack because
Yeah.
only in subscriptions you have one and only one root field. In queries and mutations, you can have arbitrary many root fields.
Yeah. I think there's another consideration here, which is that this is not unique to GraphQL. And that to a degree, telemetry by its nature, because we're trying to measure what happens in the system, is susceptible to cardinality attacks. As an example, right, at PayPal, we obviously get a lot of route testing on our services, right? Just bots spamming every URL they can think of. And that shows up in our metrics and it balloons our cardinality, right? So do you want to be able to see that attack traffic, right? Or do you only ever want to track spans for routes that are actually registered in your router, right? I don't think this
Open
changes when we go to
telemetry. Well, I mean, no, I agree. It's nothing unique about GraphQL, but open telemetry HTTP metrics at least don't include any values that are susceptible to user attack.
What about the HTTP span names?
I've just posted posted that in the chat. It specifically says if there is a low cardinality target.
Yeah. And I think this shows up in some of the telemetry where you have like http.route is the route that was matched in the router, whereas http.target or .url is the URL that the client requested. And that kind of protects us against these. And so maybe it's worth having an attribute that tracks what is the client's actual name. But I hate to say you have to have persisted queries in order to put the operation name on a trace or as like the span name, but that would be the equivalent to what exists in HTTP. So I was a little bit off base with saying it's the same.
I mean, what is interesting is that some APMs they don't like having dynamic span names anyway. I can think of one really big one. that they really prefer to have a fixed span name, and then actually they will then construct, you know, a name out of the attributes that are on the span.
But then you balloon the cardinality as well, don't you?
I'm not sure why it's done that way. All I can say is that it is that, you know, that is the way that
Say the name.
yeah. So, but I don't know. It's a sort of interesting thing, isn't it? Because if you've got HTTP method and HTTP root attributes on the span, then why are we renaming the span? It's just a sort of interesting question, really.
I think because of trace metrics, because trace metrics generally read, maybe it's not span name, but HTTP.route. You know, whatever's generally used as the span name is also used as, I'm thinking the provider that we use, resource name, right? They end up kind of going in.
I think we might be talking about the same APM.
Yeah, so the thing here is that if we just have graphical query, graphical mutation, or whatever, it's going to be, in most APMs, it's going to be useless, because essentially what they do is they group by the server root. So even if you leave out all of the HTTP stuff and you say, I purposely filter out with the SDK, if it's a graphical request, I filter out the HTTP and my server root now is the graphical request, then it's again useless, because then you just have three different traces that you can see tracing on. If we do it on operation level, it's actually very useful, but we are susceptible to cardinality attacks. And yeah, Benji's recommendation would be, in the case of subscriptions, we know it's only one. So we could just say subscription email received. Email received would be the root name. Then we could have mutation create user if you only provide one root field. And if you provide multiple, it could be mutation or mutations or something like this when you have more than one mutation. Because technically, it's also very unlikely, I know it exists, but it's unlikely to send. Most graphical mutations is also just one root field, most of them. In queries, it's arguable. I would also say in most queries, you will actually, no, that's not true. With relay, this is gone. Like if you use a good client, you will have bad tracing. If you use a bad client, you will have good tracing. Because if you do many requests per page, you will have one per root field, get users, get groups, get whatever, get products. You will have one root field. But if you use an advanced client that actually uses fragment and you compose a page request, you can have arbitrary many root fields. So it's not something that on the query side is common.
You could make it a comma separated list of the root fields capped at a certain length if you wanted. But I think just like the primary root field where it makes sense is good. I think one of the really important things that we need to reflect here is that there is really two major classes of GraphQL users. There's GraphQL users whose documents are written internally and only those ones are the ones that are executed. And there's GraphQL users where any arbitrary queries can be executed. For the former, the operation name is probably the most useful, and you can instigate institutional policy that says, for example, when you release a new version of your app, that your operation name should have an extra thing, like this is the v2 of this query, for example. But if you accept arbitrary queries from the public, operations from the public, then the operation name is useless. And in fact, it's worse than useless. It's incredibly misleading. An attacker can just take one of the operation names that you know and trust and can now use it to do any other arbitrary operation that they want to and hope that it flies under the radar. So in those cases, the hash or signature is going to be more valuable. So yeah, really, we need to reflect that these are two different categories of use case and that they have slightly different needs.
That sounds completely right. So could we use the should terminology that's prevalent in the spec to say, oh, if you're in this situation, then it should be the operation name. But if you're in this other situation, it should just be a fixed name.
Yeah.
Or is that too?
Is there any prior art task where this is done? Because this is not an attribute where we can should. You mean actually in the description of the attributes, you can have should and must as
The HTTP name example in the chat is the capital should.
Yeah.
The question just always comes back to what's the default, right? You can have any number of options, configuration options to change the behavior, but the question is, what's the default, and is it?
So now we have a problem because the default use case of GraphQL, like there's many opinions about public GraphQL APIs and if this is a good idea or not, because you open the floodgates. It's very, very hard to get this right. So I would say that most of the GraphQL APIs are probably going to be used by one company's clients. Like there's rarely, like GitHub, Shopify, and some others have a public GraphQL API where you can just execute arbitrary queries on. But even they have an internal GraphQL API that only they can call. So they differentiate these two things because it's so difficult to get it right that they have a public one which has less features and an internal one which is more feature rich in terms of what you can fetch. So the problem is that
isn't there some kind of like validation at some point? At some point you find out that this operation name doesn't map to something that you've implemented, right?
Yes, but it's depending on the document that you write. So in GraphQL you have a query type, and on the query type you have things like user by ID, product by ID, users, products, top products, and all these kind of things. Now, in a query, you can have arbitrary many of these root fields. So you can say, give me the user by ID with ID 1 and the product by ID with ID 2, and also give me the top products and all of the included whatever. So technically, it's a user input that decides what is executed on the server, which is one of the tricky things to get right in public GraphQL APIs, because that also makes you not only in tracing, it's not only attackable through tracing, it's actually inherently attackable by everything you do. So now to get this right, I would say from a security point of view, the default of the specification most likely should be it should just be GraphQL operation, but that doesn't help 99% of the users because they actually would be fine with just having it in. But Benji's comment is actually also very good because he wrote most GraphQL APIs should only accept their own documents. Most GraphQL APIs do accept arbitrary queries from the internet. So that's actually a good thing to mention because technically you should probably not have the operation name in the trace except you use persistent queries. Otherwise, you're just attackable.
Sorry, folks, I need to drop.
Oh yeah, we are out of time. Okay. Just quickly, what's the is the iteration of 4 weeks still good for everyone, or should we do less? Should we do 2 weeks in the beginning to make some headway?
I could do 2 weeks. It would be really helpful if we could make this meeting a little bit earlier in the evening. But I don't
Okay,
know.
I'm fine with that. If it's Thursday, I'm just busy the 1 hour before. So from my time 6 to 7, I'm busy. This is 7 to 8 in my timeline. I could do 2 hours before or later. Should I open? I will open a discussion. Then now we can vote on GitHub. I will open an issue because we don't have discussions enabled at the moment. Then we can also vote when the next meeting should be, because I have the feeling like in the beginning it's probably would be good if we meet bi-weekly, if this is cool for everyone, and then later we can drop, like when we actually have to do specification work, which sometimes takes a bit longer, asynchronously. Then we can go back to a month. Okay, cool. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers all.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, then in that case, let's open the issue and see. See you later. Bye-bye.